to this episode of the BSR's Rheumatology Roundtable, where I'll be speaking to the authors of the updated BSR guidelines for the treatment of axial spondyloarthritis. I'm Ernest Choi, Editor-in-Chief of Rheumatology Oxford. Joining me today are a number of people who have worked on the guidelines, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in turn. So first of all, Karl.
My name is Karl Gaffney. I'm consultant rheumatologist and professor of rheumatology in Norwich, and I've been chair of the Guidelines Development Committee.
Stephanie.
Hello, my name's Stephanie Harrison. I'm a rheumatology trainee working in Leeds at the moment, and I've been working with the guideline groups to do the literature search and to help develop some of the recommendations we'll discuss today.
Stephen.
Stephen Zhao, clinical lecturer at the University of Manchester. I had the privilege of co-chairing with Karl on this guideline and co-first authoring with Stephanie.
Dale.
Hi, I'm Dale Webb, and I'm Chief Exec of the National Axial Spondyloarthritis Society, NASS.
And last but not least, Will.
Hi, I'm Will Gregory, consultant physiotherapist and clinical lead for rheumatology at Salford Royal Hospital in Greater Manchester, and I've been supporting the guideline, I suppose, from the physiotherapy background, but also looking at some of the broader elements.
Fantastic. So welcome, everybody. Karl, can you start by giving us an overview of the guidelines and why was an update needed and what is new?
So thank you very much, Ernest. So we hope that these guidelines will provide a practical working framework for the contemporary management of axial spondyloarthritis with advanced therapies. These guidelines have been developed in partnership with the wider rheumatology MDT. We've had representation from allied health professionals, importantly, other specialties allied to rheumatology like gastroenterology, dermatology, and ophthalmology, but equally importantly, our patient partners and the National Axial Spondyloarthritis Society. It's almost 10 years since we've had the last iteration of the guidelines, and so much has changed in the field of axial spondyloarthritis since then. Our understanding and awareness of the disease has increased enormously. We have a number of new therapies available. So we now have 10 different therapies licensed for advanced management of axial spondyloarthritis, which are broadly divided into 3 different classes: TNF inhibitors, IL-17 inhibitors, and JAK inhibitors. In the previous version of the guidelines, we only had TNF inhibitors available, and we had very limited data available outside their efficacy on spinal symptoms. So we thought it was very important to inform the rheumatology community on changes in practice, and we hope that these guidelines will be very useful in your day-to-day clinical work.
Okay, fantastic. So Stephanie, could you explain a little bit about how the guideline was developed?
Certainly, thank you. So as Karl's already mentioned, the working group for the guideline was set up in 2023 to review the latest evidence that had been published since the last guideline on the topic from the BSR, which was 2016. And if we had 21 members from across the UK covering not just doctors, but all the allied healthcare professionals we work with on a day-to-day basis, and patients and charity representatives as well. So the scope for our guideline was to review all the new randomized control trial evidence and other relevant literature that had been published since 2016, and to use that to inform updated treatment and management recommendations. So the main areas we wanted to cover was to review all the latest data on the efficacy and safety of biologic and targeted synthetic DMARDs for axial spondyloarthritis, comparing to placebo, but also comparing one drug to another where there was evidence for that. Other areas that we covered were looking at the use of these medications for extramusculoskeletal manifestations, and we also covered areas such as switching drugs, when or if to use combinations of therapies, as well as treat to target strategies, dose tapering and withdrawal, and the use of biosimilars. Areas that we weren't able to cover in the guideline were other medications, for example, anti-inflammatory medications, and let's not forget the very important role for non-pharmacological therapies in the disease as well. Unfortunately, there's just not enough space in the guideline to do justice, so we focused on the biologic and targeted synthetic DMARDs. We developed a literature strategy for this with the help of an excellent librarian team at the University of Kiel, and we identified 4,817 articles initially, which underwent a full title screen by myself and Steve. And then we whittled that down to 1,087 for an abstract screen, and eventually ended up with 189 articles which underwent a data extraction, which we shared amongst the team. And it's worth noting all of this was registered prospectively on Prospero and followed the PRISMA guidance for best practice for systematic literature review. And when we had completed all the data extraction, we convened as a group and came up with our recommendations, which will be published very shortly. These were submitted for peer review and also underwent public consultation, and hope that the guideline that we've come up with will be very informative for the rheumatology community and will really help improve the care of patients.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. So the recommendations are based on a very extensive review of literature and cover many treatments. Perhaps I can come to Stephen and ask him whether he can give us a quick overview of some of the key recommendations people can find in the guideline, especially how they may differ from the previous version of the guideline.
Thanks, Ernest. So I think Karl's already alluded to this, is that we have many more drugs now. But at the back of my mind, I'm still constantly aware that these people with axial spondyloarthritis have many decades of their life for which they need treatment, and we actually really only have 3 classes to cycle through. So we really need to be careful in how we choose, or more importantly, how we don't choose certain therapies. So we actually spend a lot of the guideline real estate going into the nuances, particularly about extra musculoskeletal manifestations, because we should say that all 3 classes are pretty comparable for musculoskeletal features. It is the extra musculoskeletal manifestations where the key decisions are made. So we go into, with a lot of input and help from our gastroenterologist, dermatologist and ophthalmologist, to really bring some of that subtlety to light, to avoid kind of knee-jerk reactions to say, for example, I can't give an IL-17 inhibitor because someone in the distant past had an active history of inflammatory bowel disease, for example. So that's the first thing I'll say. And the next thing, as Steph alluded to, is about treatment strategy. This is new. So firstly, should we be tapering therapy in people who are in remission? Yes. Should we be stopping therapy? No. Should we be treating to target? And that evidence is less certain in that area, but we certainly should have a conversation with our patients to reach an agreed treatment goal. I'll end on saying that we actually opened the guideline with non-pharmacological treatment therapies, even though this was a therapeutic guideline, because of how important that is. As Steph said, we don't have space to talk about everything, but we really wanted to put front and center the fact that we must not forget about these non-pharmacological treatment options, even when we're talking about biologics.
Fantastic. So, Stephen, you mentioned that the new guidelines is taking into account some of the extra-articular manifestation into consideration. So I want to turn to Dale and ask him, can you explain how you and other experts by experience were involved in the guidelines development?
So we were full members of the working group, which of course meant that we reviewed the recommendations and made sure that they were supported by the evidence and supported by the lived experience of people, and also that the recommendations made sense to patients. But I think even more important than that was a conversation about some overarching principles that brought us into a shared space as health professionals and patients. And the sentiment behind those principles, I think, will be really important for patients to know about. And so those principles say that the the primary goal of treatment is to help people lead healthy and productive lives. Management decisions should be based in a shared decision-making process between the patient and the clinician, that we value a holistic approach with an MDT, but also considering non-pharmacological and pharmacological interventions together. So the sentiment behind those overarching principles, I think, were really important in bringing us into that shared space.
So what does the guideline mean for patients? How would it benefit people with axial spondyloarthritis? I think both Karl, Stephen, and yourself mentioned that axial spondyloarthritis in the main is a lifelong disease, is something that patient needs to understand themselves. How would this guideline help them?
I think this will be good news for patients. It will be reassuring to know that a group has been meeting behind the scenes to consider the latest evidence, and that therefore that the treatment decisions that the clinician is making with the patient is based upon the best available evidence, and that they are a key part of that decision-making process.
Right. So I guess the healthcare system is changing, and physiotherapists are increasingly taking on a very important role in managing patients with axial spondyloarthritis. So I want to turn to Will, ask him as a physiotherapist, how do you think physiotherapists and other allied health professionals, being a vital part of the MDT in supporting axial spondyloarthritis patients, what are your roles, and how do you think this updated guidelines will be used by physiotherapists and other allied health professionals?
Well, I think it works in two ways, really. And the first is what you've kind of introduced, the way that we are seeing health professionals stepping into more advanced roles across the UK in the delivery of rheumatology services. And we're seeing consultant nurses, consultant AHPs, consultant pharmacists. So we're looking at a guideline that needs to respect the potential roles that can be taken by health professionals. So I had a little bit of job where some of the drafting came through and said the rheumatologist could do this, the rheumatologist could do that, just to say the rheumatology team. However, the key one that stayed in there is coordinated by a rheumatologist. And even where we're seeing advanced and consultant practice by health professionals, it's always within a rheumatology team. So I think it's important that we can develop AHP, nursing and pharmacy roles, but also be within an established rheumatology team with support from rheumatologists as a part of that as well. So if that's one angle, the guidelines supporting that advancing role, the other from my physiotherapy background is the crucial role that we know exercise can have for people living with axial spondyloarthritis. It's difficult to have RCTs, and Steph mentioned randomized controlled trials as the primary piece of evidence we looked at in developing the guidelines, and there are very few, if any, RCTs in exercise for axial spondyloarthritis. So the evidence that we have isn't quite at the level to make it into the guideline. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it, and we think we should. So it's respecting the role that any exercise professional can have in engaging our patients in keeping as fit and active as they can, because we know that's an anti-inflammatory treatment as well.
Great. I know that there's a GP in the guideline working group. Will, what do you think are the key things in the guidelines for people in primary care to take away?
Well, I think it relates to that first overarching principle we published, which is our primary goal of treatment of people living with axSpA is to enable them to lead healthy and productive lives. And that therefore gives us a remit for the guideline to cover every version of axial spondyloarthritis. And Karl mentioned kind of advanced therapies, which are probably for those people living with a more severe or advanced version of the condition. But we're seeing a big population of our axial spondyloarthritis cohort who perhaps don't reach that requirement, and therefore they may be more managed in primary care. So I think the guideline with its scope will increase the knowledge of our primary care colleagues, particularly as they're seeing more MSK work in extended roles.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to Karl. I see that there are a number of non-rheumatology specialists in the working group, and the guideline is endorsed by the British Society of Gastroenterology. Why was this multi-specialty involvement important, and what sort of recommendations can we see in the guideline as a result?
I think it's very important, Ernest, to remember that there are many different aspects to this disease, and 1 in 3 of our patients will have an extra musculoskeletal manifestation. the commonest being uveitis, followed by psoriasis and inflammatory bowel disease. So if we're going to embark on shared decision making and provide optimum care for our patients, it's very important that we have this collaborative approach to management. So it really was essential that we had involvement, and we're very grateful to those societies for supporting the work in the development of this guideline. And I think the evidence is in the table that will be presented in the paper, looking at the efficacy of these agents across those musculoskeletal manifestations, because it's very important that we choose the right treatment for an individual patient. As someone's mentioned already, most of these treatments work well for the axial symptoms, but there are very clear distinguishing features when we look at the extra musculoskeletal manifestations, and to some extent the peripheral musculoskeletal manifestations. So there's rather a lot to consider when choosing the optimum therapy for an individual patient.
And finally, how can we support listeners and readers of the guidelines to ensure the recommendations are implemented into clinical practice? I will go to each of the speakers to ask them for their advice. So I'll start with Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Ernest. So the first thing I'll recommend everybody, all the readers, listeners do, is go and read the full guideline, because we only had the space to talk about more nuanced aspects of management and treatment selection in the full guideline, which by necessity had to be distilled down in the summary. We do provide a shorter, in fact, very short versions of it for people who are on the go or in the clinic, like a cheat sheet, effectively, of the key recommendations and the indications for certain treatments. We're also work with BSR to work on online learning materials, for example, e-learning. So watch this space.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Yeah, I think building on what Steve has already mentioned, it's important that we make the guideline accessible for healthcare professionals, but also, if possible, we can produce some material for patients. And moving forward, we're hoping to work with the BSR and the leading patient charities nationally to try and do that. Because any treatment decisions we make have to be made in partnership with the patients at the end of the day. So again, watch this space, and we hope to produce some material soon to help people in clinic achieve that.
And how about Dale?
It's been a really valuable process, and like Stephanie, we're keen to work with BSR to produce a version of this which is accessible and meaningful to patients. And of course, as part of our ongoing campaigning and lobbying work, making sure that we can embed this in the call for really high quality, consistent rheumatology care across the UK.
And Will?
Just a small chunk of the idea of high quality care that Dale's introduced is thinking about how we deliver this. So the guideline does emphasize the importance of AHPs, and particularly for me, from physiotherapy point of view, have we got enough physiotherapists dedicated to rheumatology? Have we got enough space to prioritize this kind of work in musculoskeletal physiotherapy departments? And I hope the guideline will support that with regards to business cases, extra staffing, and prioritizing what we can do for long-term conditions like axial spondyloarthritis.
And I'll ask how to wrap up.
So thanks very much, Ernest. So this has been a very enjoyable experience, and just as the chair of the committee, I just want to thank all my co-authors, and I said there were 21 of them, so it was a big group of people to manage, and I'd like to express a huge thanks to Stephanie and Stephen, who've done the majority of this work, and to Lindsay at the BSR for keeping us all in order. But as a concluding statement, Ernest, I really want to send home the message that this is a practical document that we feel clinicians should refer to in their clinical practice. There's lots of useful information. There's a summary sheet, as Stephen says, that is the kind of basic guide, but there's a lot more detail on the nuances of therapies in the full document. And I think it's really important that clinicians refer to this, particularly in situations where they might be struggling with management or struggling with access to advanced therapies, because in certain parts of the country, there's still limited access for certain products. So it's very important that they are familiarize themselves with the contemporary evidence and use that to their advantage to support our patients in clinical practice. We're hoping that this will become a living document, and rather than having to, come back and convene in 5 or 10 years' time, that this document can be updated regularly when new contemporary information and evidence becomes available. So enjoy reading it and go forth and look after your patients as best as you can. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I want to thank all the speakers for helping us to understand about the new guidelines on the management of axial spondyloarthritis, bringing us up to date with the management of this condition to help patients to live well. We have more treatment choices, but our job is to manage the patients right from the community primary care through to the specialist care in a multidisciplinary fashion to enable them to live as full a life as possible. So all the BSR guidelines and linked resources are available from the guideline page on the BSR website. Thank you for you joining us to listen to this roundtable, and I hope you look forward to more episodes in the future. Thank you.